Perfect. Yeah, guys, ask away. I want this to be as interactive as possible, so it's not just me talking into a microphone the whole time. But let's get started. Just a quick background about me. I've been a fan of ON1 software for as long as I've been a photographer. I started using Photoshop and Lightroom in the beginning, back when ON1 was just a plugin, and it's been amazing to watch it just evolve over time into this what it is now, which is a real legitimate competitor to the Lightroom and Photoshop workflow. So my goal with this webinar is just to go through one image of mine for sure, and maybe a couple more if we have time, but just to show what ON1 Photo RAW is capable of, because it's incredible how it's come together. But let's just hop right in. So the main image that we're going to be working on here is this one from Arches National Park in Utah. So I don't know how many of you have been here, but Arches is one of those parks that every time I go in, my jaw is just on the ground. You come in through the main gate, and you have to go up these switchbacks with these towering sandstone cliffs on your left-hand side, and you eventually come around the corner, and this is one of the main sights you see. So you can see my little magnifying glass here. We've got the Three Gossips, which is this formation over here on the left. We've got the Oregon right here, and then this one back here is the Tower of Babel. But what I want to do, why I took this image, was I was leading a workshop, and I wanted to show how you can take a lot of different images and blend them together if you can't get everything in one shot. And there's a lot going on here. So we've got the sky, and I took a darker exposure here for the sky, so you can see that the foreground's pretty dark. And then if we go over on the bottom of the film strip here, we've got another for the sky, but that's just because I took two of them. And then I brightened it up for the foreground to get more detail on that. And I might be able to get as much detail as I needed out of the sky in these brighter ones, but I like to just cover my bases and take darker and lighter exposures just to play it safe and make sure I have them if I need them. But what I was really doing here by taking a lot of different images was I was getting all these different versions of the car trails, because it wasn't super dark outside yet. You can see over here that I was taking like 15-second exposures. And what I wanted to do is just get a lot of different images of car trails so that I could blend them together later and have a really interesting looking S-curve going through the foreground here with a lot of different versions of car trails. And taking a lot of different shots also helped fill the gaps, because if you've been in any national park and you've taken shots like this where you're doing 30-second, 15-second exposures, depending on where you're looking, there's usually, in this scene, for example, there was probably 90% of the traffic coming through was headlights, because we're looking into the park and people are leaving. And it was a lot more rare to get those taillights of people going into the park, because there's just not a lot of people going into the park at night. So let's get started on the editing part. So this is the first one, and I'm in the browse mode right now. So I've just got the film strip down here. You're not seeing this left-hand side here because it's just not necessary now. So I have that collapsed down. But from here, we'll just hop into develop with this first image. Okay, and we've still got our film strip here. So if we need to hop between images, we can. But the first thing I'm going to do is look at this photo. So with these darker images, my main focus is going to be the sky. I don't really care as much about the foreground, but the foreground is still important, and I'll get to that in a second. So looking at this image, the main thing I'll do is I'll play with exposure if I need to later, but I usually start with my highlights. So I'll pull the highlights down. We'll go ahead and switch over to the histogram here. I'll play with highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And I like to get a good white point and a good black point. And then I'm just kind of going back and forth, just kind of going off feel, just looking at it and playing with the sliders, getting them to a good place. Now I'll pull the exposure down just a little bit. All right. I'll pull the temperature down a little bit. And what I'm kind of thinking here is I want the sky to be cooler, and I want the foreground to eventually be kind of warmer. Not too warm, because it is taken after sunset with the light kind of fading quickly, but I want there to be a good separation of warm and cool because like your oranges and your blues are complementary colors. And if you can fit those into your landscape scenes, it really helps to separate rather than just having like a warm sky and a warm foreground. So that's kind of what I'm thinking here as I go through. So I'll pull up the saturation a little bit just to see what that's doing. It's bringing out those blues in the sky and those oranges and yellows where the sunlight is coming through. So that all looks good. What I'm noticing here as I go through is that the blues and the oranges and the yellows look good, but this red and the taillight here is kind of getting a little bit too out of hand. So of course I could just pull back the saturation, but I like what it's doing up here. So what I'll do is I'll go up here to the overall settings. I'll click show more, and we'll go for a color adjustment, which will show up at the bottom here. And at the bottom here, you can see the strip of different colors. So red is the first one, so it's already highlighted. And I'll just pull that red back a little bit just to get that tail light under control. All right, while we're here, I'll just go ahead and play with some of the other colors too, see what that does. So bring up a little bit more blues, which is looking really good up here in the upper level of the sky. We'll go to our oranges and bring those up a little bit. Okay. All right, so I want to try to explain something as far as my mindset or my view on blending exposures. I don't really do much HDR stuff these days. I haven't in several years, but what I do a lot of is manually blending of exposures. And it's an art form. It's something that takes practice. But what I've noticed along the way is that you don't want to have too much of a difference between your sky and your foreground. And what I mean by that is if I didn't worry about my foreground at all in this image right here and just focused on the sky, I could get all the detail I wanted out of the sky, and then I'd have a almost completely black foreground. And then on my foreground image, I would have a really nicely exposed foreground, but my sky would probably be blown out if I just didn't care about it at all. And the problem there is that when I go to blend those together, I'm going to have a really high contrast area between my sky and my foreground. And if I don't get that blend 100% perfect on a pixel by pixel basis, I'm going to have like a good sky against a foreground, and if it's not perfect, I'm going to have these black pixels along the edges from my sky exposure. I hope that makes sense, but what I'm trying to say is that I want to pull out as much detail as I can out of this foreground, even if it doesn't look great, because you can see how it's kind of washed out and the tones are kind of murky. As long as I have some detail in there, it's going to help me in the long run when I start to blend these together. Okay, so that's basically it for the sky. Okay, I think it looks pretty good. I might pull up my saturation a little bit more. And now that that's done, I'll come down here to my film strip, and I'm going to Command or Control, if you're on a PC, click this second one, because these are both taken at the same exposure level. And then I'll come over here and I'll click Sync. And that's going to sync all those settings up to this next one. Okay, so now we have the same exact thing done to the second image. But I do probably want to keep in mind that I want to bring in this car trail from this darker one. So I'll keep that in mind for later. But let's hop on to the foreground one now that we're done with that. So now I'm going to be focusing on the exact opposite. I want to make the foreground look as good as possible in the develop module. And while I'm not really focused on the sky in these, I want to try to bring as much detail as I can so that I have a good gradual blend later on when we start getting into layers. So let's get started here. We'll bring up the shadows and the exposure level a little bit. And you can see that the sky's kind of getting out of hand really quickly. So I'll bring those highlights down. I'll just bring them down all the way, bring my whites down a little bit. And when you do this, regardless of the program that you're using, when you start bringing up your shadows and bringing down your highlights, you're going to get this flat kind of bland looking image. So you usually have to counteract that with some contrast. So I'll bring that in. But where this is really going to start looking good is when I take this temperature slider and bring it up. If you've ever been to the Southwest, you'll know how important it is in a scene like this to warm up your foreground and bring out as much of those red and orange tones in the sandstone as possible. And we're going to get a lot of that done here in Develop, but later on we'll hop into effects to really make this foreground pop. And that's what you kind of have to keep in mind. The Develop module in ON1 Photo RAW, and whether you're in ON1 Photo RAW or Lightroom, these raw sliders, they're good. And a lot of times you can get probably 95% of the way there just in Lightroom or just in ON1 Photo RAW or just in the Develop module in Photo RAW. But if you really want to take it to the next step, you need to think about going into effects and adding some really heavy hitting presets and build outs of your own adjustments and whatnot, and then mask those in selectively if needed. So let's keep going here. Bring down the blacks a little bit. I want to get as much contrast out of here as I can. And keep looking at that sky on and off to make sure I'm not getting too crazy there. All right. I think that looks pretty good though. Keeping in mind it's not done yet, but I think that's a good stopping point for Develop. Okay, just going through here and seeing if there's anything else I need to do. But with that done, I'll hold down the Shift key. So before I just held down the Command key because I was just doing 2 images. Here I'm going to do the Shift because I've got more than 2. So I'll hold down Shift and click the last image here. And that's going to highlight all the ones in between it too. And then I'll hit sync, and that should sync all of those up. There we go. So now we have the same foreground on all these and the same sky on all these. And that's it. That's all we have to do and Develop. So I'm going to hop back over to Browse here, because you have to go to Browse if you want to open up multiple images inside of layers. It doesn't work in Develop, and I'm not sure why. But I have all these selected here. So now I'll hold down the Command or Control key again, and I'll just click these. So now I have all of these images selected. And then I'm going to just go over here to the right-hand side and click Layers. So it's going to say there's 6 photos selected. Are you sure you want to work with all of these? We'll hit yes. And then we get this dialog box. So if you do New Photo, it's going to open up 6 different eventual PSDs inside of layers. So we want to be sure to click Add as Layer. And that will take us over into layers. We'll give that a second. How are the questions coming, Michael? Anything that needs to be addressed?
It's pretty quiet right now. So just as a reminder to everyone, there is a questions box over there on the control panel for the webinar. You can use that at any time. I'm looking at questions. I can pass them up to James at any time. So feel free to fire away.
Awesome. Okay, so we're inside of layers now. And layers, if you're familiar with Photoshop, it's very similar. We finally have the ability outside of Photoshop to work with layers and work with masks and brushes. And it's an incredible program, and it's come a long way since it was introduced. I think it was a couple years ago, or a few years ago. I can't exactly remember. But if you're unfamiliar with layers and how they work, what we have over here on the right-hand side is this stack of layers. And whatever's on the top is typically going to have precedence over anything below it. So what we're looking at, even though this bottom layer is highlighted, what we're looking at here in the middle is this top layer, because this top layer is, it's over everything else, and it's got an opacity of 100%. So that's all we can see. So if you want to see whatever is beneath it, you have to turn that layer off, and that can be done by clicking this little eyeball. And now you can see that that just changed a little bit, because the only thing changing between these exposures is the car trails. So as I turn these off, we'll just go down and get to our bottom layer. So it doesn't really matter a whole lot the order that these are in, but just to keep everything kind of easy to work with, I'll go to this bottom layer down here. We'll select that and I'll double click the word composite and I'll call this my foreground. Okay, so that's going to be my main foreground layer. And then we'll come up to the second one. We'll turn that on. We'll double click that and we'll call that sky. So now we have a clear distinction of what we're working with. We've got a sky and a foreground layer. So now we need to go to work on creating a mask to get rid of this foreground and just show the sky. So to do that, we'll go over here to the left-hand side and we'll click Quick Mask. And you can do this with either. So I could come down here, do it with the sky, turn the sky off, or do it with the foreground. And that might work better in this case, actually, because we have a pretty bright sky and a good distinct difference between the foreground and the sky here. So what I can do is I can just drag this on top. And then we just have to decide what we're trying to do here. So now I have the foreground on top, threw a little bit of a curveball there, and the sky on bottom. So if I want to show the sky below it, I need to create a mask that punches through the sky on this foreground layer. So you can see that my quick mask is green right now, the brush there. So if I hit X, it'll switch to red. And red means that you want to get rid of whatever you're looking at. So all I have to do now is just draw a line going through the sky here. And I want to make sure that I get a good sampling of each part of the sky as I go through. Do something like that. And then ON1 will go to work on dropping that sky in, just like that. Okay, so you can see it's done a pretty good job. It got us most of the way to where we wanted to go, but we do have a little bit of touch-up work to do. So we'll get out of the quick mask and we'll just go to our masking brush. You can also just hit B to bring that up. And then we're gonna go up here to this little brush icon with a star over it, which is your perfect brush. All right, I'm gonna hit Command or Control plus, and that's gonna zoom in. And then we can go over here to our navigator and come up to the cliffs here. I'll use the bracket keys to make my brush a little bit shorter, or smaller rather. And then I'm just gonna start brushing along the edge here. And the perfect brush is cool because wherever that minus sign is, that's what ON1 is gonna use. Get a little bit further out here. That's what ON1 is gonna use as a reference for what I'm trying to brush out. So as long as that minus sign doesn't bleed into the cliffs, you can see that, it's gonna use the sky and say we need to separate the sky from this edge here. So I can pull this minus sign all the way down into this little hole here, and it'll just gradually give us a really solid mask to work with here. I like to hold down the space bar, which brings up the move tool to just drag along. You can also just come up here to the navigator if you'd like to do that. All right, I see a question here with about the smudge on the left side of the sky. Yeah, that's gonna be in all of the raw images because it was like, it's probably a piece of dust or hair that was on my sensor. I was wondering if people would ask about that, and they did. So we could get to it now, but what I typically do is I worry about that later after I've kind of processed the image. Everybody has a different preference on that. Doesn't really matter what you do, but once we get all of the layer blending done, we'll get rid of that really quickly. Right, so I'm just coming along the edge here. Right. You can spend as much or as little time as you want on this, but you can see that it's doing a really good job. I could spend the next, hour if I wanted to going through and making sure everything was perfect, but just for the sake of time, I'll do a quicker version here. Okay, we'll hit Command 0, and that's gonna fit the image to the screen. And there we go. So now we have our sky dropped into our foreground, and we can get to work on bringing in these different car trails. One thing that I'm noticing real quick, you're gonna hit Control M to get your mask view up. And you can see that for whatever reason, that quick mask that we did earlier brought in some of the car trail. So I'll turn off the perfect brush and then hit X to paint in and just get rid of that, because it was bringing in some weird looking pixels on the car trail there. Okay, so let's turn on this next layer here, and we'll move up to this one. Now, here's where we get into just bringing in the car trails, and this is where we get into blend modes. So when you're dealing with like fireworks or car trails or headlights or light painting, the blend mode that works best is going to be lighten. So what we'll do is we'll go up here with this layer highlighted, we'll go up to the blend mode where it says normal, and we'll just go down to lighten. And what you can see now is that we have a similar looking image, but if I toggle this on and off, you'll see that a few things are changing. We're getting some changes in the sky, and we're getting some changes in the car trails right here. So the lighten blend mode is just going to bring in the brightest pixels in the image and leave out all the darker ones. But we don't want to bring in any part of the sky because we have our sky set. So what we'll do now is we'll hit Command I or Control I on a PC, and that's going to put a black mask on top of this layer right here. So now we can't see anything. This black mask covers everything. So the saying that will help you if you're unfamiliar with this is that black conceals, when you're dealing with masking, black conceals while white reveals. So there's a black mask on this, and that conceals everything on that layer. So if I toggle this on and off now, there's nothing happens. So what we want to do is bring that car trail back. So with that brush selected, I'll hit X, because you can see that little minus sign on the brush. We'll hit X to bring the plus sign up. And then I'll just start drawing along this road here until I see, there we go, those brake lights. Okay, and that's all we needed to bring in from that darker exposure. So there we go. Okay, from there, we'll go up to the next layer. Make sure that's highlighted. And then we'll toggle that on and off to see what we're dealing with here. And I really like this one because what we had was there was a tour bus, and I don't know what a tour bus was doing coming into the park at night. Maybe it was a huge workshop, I don't know, but you can see that these brake lights are a lot higher than the rest of them, and that's because it was a big old tour bus. So this one is going to add a lot more interest to this road. So again, same thing, we're going to hit Command I to put a black mask on top of it, which will hide everything. We're going to set our blend mode to lighten, and then with our brush, we'll just start drawing that in, or painting it in rather. And you can see there that we got those bus taillights, but also we got some brake lights at the end of this turn here, and we didn't have that before. So that's just more of that road that we have completed now, which is really nice. All right, same thing on the next one. Just come up here, set it to lighten. You can toggle this on and off to see what we're dealing with. Okay, so we're getting a little bit of a starburst around the corner here, and we're getting a lot more on this part of the road. Command or Control I to throw a black mask over. Hit X to get a plus sign on the brush there, and then we'll just paint that in. Okay, I'm going to lift off the brush here, and then I'm going to focus on this turn here. I'm going to hit that. And now I just need to decide if I like that or not, because it's covering up those brake lights. So if I hit Command Z, that'll get rid of that. And I kind of like the brake lights more, because we have a lot of headlights here, so I might just leave that off. Okay, now we'll come up to the last one. Same thing, blend mode of lighten. We'll toggle it on and off to see what we have to work with here. And This one's kind of a toss-up. I don't really think we're getting a whole lot, actually. Well, okay, we're getting a little bit of brake lights up here, and I like that. So we'll hit Command I. We'll make the brush a little bit smaller here, and then we'll just bring that in.
So James, to jump in here with a question I've seen pop up, how do you know what blend mode to choose, and why did you choose blending lighten over some of the other options that are available in there?
Mostly it's just trial and error over the years, but lighten, and you can also use lighten color. It's very similar, this one right here. But these other blend modes are going to do vastly different things. And with ON1 Photo RAW, all you have to do is just hover over the blend mode and you'll see what it's doing. So you, like this multiply looks terrible. So obviously you wouldn't use that. Screen is usually going to make it brighter. You can see that. But the lighten blend mode is what we're after because of what that blend mode does. It brings in bright pixels. And since we're dealing with headlights and taillights, those are going to be brighter than the rest of the scene. So it does a good job of just bringing in the light from that and leaving everything else out of the way. But it's not perfect because there's brighter pixels in the sky. And that's why we have to do things like masking and then brushing into that mask to just bring through the parts that we want. If I didn't use a blend mode and just threw a black mask over the image and painted through that, we're also going to be bringing in those brighter pixels from the surrounding areas. And if those aren't exactly the same exposure level across all of the different images that you're trying to bring in, it's going to be a nightmare. So that's where blend modes come in. Hope that answers the question. If not, just keep asking. I'm happy to stop at any time.
Definitely will do. Thanks, James.
Yeah, absolutely. That's basically it as far as blending these exposures together. So we're done with the blend. So we've got a good foreground here. We've got the sky here. Now we can get rid of this crazy little smudge over here and get into effects. So now that we're done with layers, we don't really need all these anymore. So we'll start working with a stamped layer on top of it. So to do that, you know, in Photoshop, I've always been a big fan of the shortcut that I always call the claw, which is a Shift Option Command E. But in Photo RAW, we don't have to do quite as many. We can just do Shift Command J. And if you can't remember that, you can just go up to Layers and then choose New Stamped Layer. What this does is it takes all the layers that you've been working on, as long as you have the top one highlighted. So you could have 2 layers or you could have 200 layers. But if you select that top layer and then do Shift Command J, it's going to take all of those layers and combine them into one new layer. So now I can turn off all these layers and it doesn't really do anything because it's just, we have this new stamped layer on top that is everything we've done combined into one. So I will hit Command J now to duplicate that. And the reason I'm doing that is because we'll rename this our new sky. And we'll rename this one our new foreground. Okay. So for our sky, highlight that. We'll go over to our healing brush here and we'll make sure that we don't have to look at that smudge anymore. I'm not sure what that is. I tend to change lenses in the field a lot more than I should, regardless of the conditions. So I've been on the sand dunes in Death Valley with 20 to 30 mile an hour winds, and I've still attempted to change lenses. I'll turn my back to it and open up my coat and get in there. But yeah, I for my style in the field, I have to clean my sensor a lot. So. All right, so that's gone. All I did was bring up the healing brush and just draw over it a little bit. I think I did a pretty good job of getting rid of that. So, okay, what now? Now I'll turn off the sky layer and we'll highlight the foreground. You can open up any of the layers that you want at any time in effects. And then when you're done in effects, it'll just take you right back into layers. So we'll do the foreground first. Okay, so with that highlighted, I'll hop over into effects by clicking the effects icon on the right-hand side. And now, just like in develop, our main focus here is the foreground. I don't really care about the sky, but what we want to do here is we want to brighten things up and bring out as much detail as we can out of this foreground and make it really look good and finish it off. So, you know, there's two different ways that you can approach effects, and I don't think either one is right or wrong, but one is using presets and one is building your own effects from the right-hand side. So today, just for the sake of showing you what effects is capable of, I'm going to build out our own effects instead of using, you know, one-click presets and then editing them a little bit. So we'll go over here to the right-hand side and click Add Filter. And we'll get to work. Okay, so one thing I want to do is I want to warm it up a little bit more. So let's see here. We'll do photo filter. Now the default filter is going to be a cooling filter, but you can change that. So you can use any of these filters up here. You can change the color to whatever you want, or you can use this drop down. And I think this orange one will work pretty good. Yeah. Okay. You can hit the backslash key at any time to see your before and after. So you can see that's before and that's after. So we've warmed the foreground up a little bit. I think that looks really good. And as I'm stacking these filters, I like to just click the top of them when I'm done, just to collapse it. That way, when I start adding more, I'm not gonna have to do a lot of scrolling, because it can get pretty out of hand quick if you leave them all open at one time. One filter that I love to use almost all the time is the sunshine filter, because it just adds a lot of like really good contrast and it brings out details. And you know, you just change the amount as needed. So you can bring it up or down. You can see what it's doing. If I go too far with it, it kind of brings too much black and grunginess into it. So you do have to be a little bit careful with it, but I'll just pull it up to where I think it looks good, which is, or pull it down rather, because it was at 50 before. So I think 35 looks pretty good. Okay, I'll collapse that down. Oh, it opened up photo filter again. I'm gonna have to close those each time. Hopefully not. Next one is gonna be, let's try glow. Glow is a really cool one. I love glow. The best way, if you're more advanced on the Photoshop side, if you've ever created like an Orton effect, it's similar to that. In Photoshop, you have to create a new stamped layer and then add like a Gaussian blur to that layer. And then you add some contrast and brightness, and then you take that layer down in opacity, and it just creates this glow. It's actually blurring the pixels to a certain extent, but it kind of, in ON1 at least, it protects the edges, which is really cool. So with anything, I like to grab the amount slider and I'll take it all the way up. And you can see that it gets crazy because there's a lot of shadows and contrast and blacks in here. So if you bring it up too far, it's gonna take it to the extreme. So you never want to, almost never want to go to the extreme with these sliders. So I'll just pull this down. And just like if you're doing the Orton effect in Photoshop, you want subtlety is key here. So I'll just pull this up to maybe around 10. We'll click this checkbox on and off. It's a very subtle change, but it just kind of adds this ethereal, kind of surreal look to it. And if you don't go too far with it, it's just really nice and subtle. I might even bring that down a little bit to like 8. All right, next thing, let's go into, let's bring the saturation up a little bit. There's a few different ways you can do this. We'll just do color enhancer. We'll bring up the saturation just a bit, and you'll see that that's going to bring out our reds a little bit more, make those look good. And then let's do a tone enhancer. Okay, this is similar to what you're doing in develop. We're not going to go too crazy here, but I'll bring up the highlights a little bit in those car trails just to make them glow a little bit. If you look right here, if I bring that up and down, you can see that. just making it kind of a little bit more bright and glowy. Something like that. All right, we'll bring up our shadows because I think I might have brought in a little bit too much contrast. Just bring out a little bit more detail there. Okay, and I think that looks pretty good. So we can hit before and after again. So this is what we started with. And this is what I always like about post-processing, because you come into effects and I'm thinking it looks pretty good. There's not a whole lot to do. But now when I compare it with what we did and look before, it's like, wow, that looked actually kind of terrible. And that's what I love. It's because you always get to look at it with a fresh set of eyes and you can compare with before and after. And what's cool is you can just, bypass all of these filters. So you can collapse those down. And then you can come up to opacity here. And then if you wanted to, you could say, okay, maybe that's too far. And let's just pull it back. This is before and after. But actually, I think 100% looks pretty good here. And now that we're done with the foreground, we'll just hit done. And that's going to take us all the way back to layers. All right. And now we have our sky. And you know what? I honestly think that the sky looks pretty good right here, but just for the sake of, we're doing a webinar, we're showing how to do masking and layer blending and stuff like that. Just for the sake of that, we'll go ahead and mess with the sky, but I think you could just as easily leave it where it is right now, because we've got this nice glow right here and we've got good blues. And of course we have that stupid squiggly line right there again, but if for no other reason than to not have to look at that, we'll process the sky here. All right, go into effects. All right, so let's add a photo filter. We'll stick with the cooling one, but we'll take the opacity of it down. Just something really subtle, just to make the sky a little bit more cool. So maybe around 16, maybe a little bit less. And then let's do glow. Love glow. Let's bring that up to, you can see it's doing a lot better job with the sky than it did with the foreground. We can take it a lot further. And it gives us that look that I like from the previous one, where this part where the sun is kind of shining through, it just makes it really nice and vibrant. So we might actually do a pretty strong effect with the glow here. All right, and the last thing I like to do with my landscapes, we don't have to deal with noise a lot with landscape photos, as you fellow landscape photographers know. We're most of the time using tripods, and if there's any ambient available light, we'll usually set our cameras to like ISO 100, so you really have to push those pixels far to bring in noise. So I usually don't do a lot of noise reduction to my foregrounds, but I almost always apply noise reduction to my skies, because I like those skies to be nice and creamy and smooth, and not distracted by noise and grain and stuff like that. So we'll grab a noise reduction filter, and for these I like to zoom in pretty close. So I'll zoom in here with Command plus. You can also use these up here, 50, 25, fit, 100%. But if you need to get closer than that, I like to do Command plus. And then with the navigator, we'll come up to an edge here, and we'll take this luminance slider all the way up and all the way down and just see what it's doing. So there's not a ton of noise in the sky, but there is some. So I'll just bring the slider up until I see that go away. We're not going to have much color noise in the sky, so we don't have to deal with that. And detail, you can bring that up to regain some of the detail that you got rid of, but you have to be careful with it because it's kind of counterproductive to what you're trying to do. It's almost bringing your luminance down in a way, but somewhere around there should be good. We'll hit Command 0 to go out. And you can see that the noise reduction did a lot to the foreground. The foreground looks terrible right now. That's fine though, because we're only concerned with the sky. So we'll hit done. And that will take us back into layers. All right, so what we can do here is we could make a new mask, of course, but one of the cool things you can do is, regardless of how many layers I'm working with, I like to create a really strong mask at the beginning, separating my sky and my foreground. And that's what we did down here. So what we can do, instead of creating a whole new mask and having to worry about using the quick brush, or the magic brush rather, again, to get into the tiny little details, we can just come down here to this mask we made before and right click it. And then we can choose copy mask. And then we can come up to this top layer here. And for some reason, I'm not sure, Michael, but for some reason, you can't ever get the paste mask option here. So you have to go up here to mask, and then from the drop down, paste mask. There's no shortcut for it. So we'll click that. The only problem now is that we have the same mask from before where it's blocking out the sky and showing the foreground. And we want the opposite of that. So we'll hit Command I to invert it. And now we have the same exact result from before. We have effects that are applied to the sky and effects that are applied to the foreground. And looking at it now, I think that the sky is a little bit too strong. So we can just pull that back. Of course, that's going to bring in that squiggly line again. That stupid squiggly line. But what we can do when we have that opacity set to where we want, we can just hit Shift Command J again. Go to our healing brush and give that hair or whatever that is another once over. And there we go. All right, so I think that's a good stopping point for this image. How are we looking, Michael? How's the time?
Time's looking good. We have about 30 minutes left from what I see here. There are a few workflow gear questions, if you don't mind fielding right now.
Sure.
First question, Wacom tablet. Are you using one? Are you using a mouse? How are you doing?
Yes. Yeah, I've used a Wacom tablet since the beginning. Now, I don't think I have even a newer one because the one I have right now works just fine. So this is a corded Intuos 5 Touch small. So a lot of people out there, they'll, or some people, they have like their huge ones, but I like the small one because it doesn't take up a whole lot of desk real estate. I can throw it in my backpack if I need to travel, which means I don't have to have one for travel and one for the office. And some people like the large ones because they can make smaller adjustments because it's closer to the size of the screen. But I've never once thought, man, I wish this was a little bit, larger or anything like that. So I like the small one. Yeah.
Awesome. And let me find this question here. There's a lot of customers asking about the chisel tools, especially around the horizon line. Didn't know if you wanted to maybe cover that just real quickly, show them how that tool works.
Yeah. So like I said before, you can spend as much or as little time as possible on these edges, and you can see that there are some imperfections in them. And when you're dealing with the separation between your sky and foreground, you do have to make sure that that's perfect, but it's a little boring on webinars because it's tedious, and even video tutorials. It's just kind of tedious work if you don't have a 100% perfect separation there. So we have these like white pixels. So what you can do is, now I'm trying to think here if this is going to work or not, because I have this new stamped layer. So what I might have to do is turn these off and go down here to our beginning, because this is where we have our real separation of light and darkness. Up here, we've done a lot of changes to the image. So I'm just going down here because this is our original blend where I would make the changes initially. So with this top one selected, we can grab our chisel tool, which is right here on the left side, the chisel. Okay, and that gives us this plus or minus sign. So what it does is it just it's exactly what it sounds like. It just chisels away at the mask, and you can choose the amount of pixels that you want it to chisel away at. But basically, if you draw over it, it's going to take the mask down 1 pixel. So you'll see that we can just go along the edge here, and it's going to get rid of that line. It works really good. So just like that, we can go along the top here, and it'll just refine that mask on a 1 pixel by 1 pixel basis. And if you go over it again, it would do it another time. Now, Michael, you can help me out a little bit here, because I was watching Brian's webinar a few weeks ago, and he had pointed out a trick to just do the entire mask at one time, and I can't remember what that was. It's not something I would use terribly often, but
the entire chisel around the horizon line.
Yeah.
Not sure what tool that was. I'd have to go back and look. I mean, if any other customers are curious, that webinar is recorded, and on our blog, there's a recorded webinars category, which is a great segue into this webinar is also being recorded as well. So there are quite a few questions about that. This will be recorded. I believe you can actually double click the chisel tool. Yeah, thanks for the assist on that one, Alan. I see your comment just came in. So that's
yeah, there it is. Perfect.
And Roger and Paul, thank you for that. So
thanks, guys. Yeah. So you just double click the icon over here on the left, and you can watch down here. If I double click that, it just kind of starts creeping down. So you have to be careful with it. Usually 1 pixel is plenty. If you keep clicking it, it's going to start looking kind of weird. So just double click that, and it'll do that. So. All right, we'll turn that top layer back on. All right, anything else?
It's looking pretty quiet right now. If anyone does have questions, I've mentioned this before, there's a questions box. A lot of you are using that. I'm trying my best to get to as many as I can. Just keep firing away. We have about 30 minutes left in the webinar. So James, if you want to just keep going to the next image, go for it.
Perfect. Yeah, let's, I'll just close this out. I've already processed this one for the webinar preview, so I was just kind of doing it again there. So we'll just hop over.
Actually, before you jump on, there's a pretty good question here from Mark Tippett. Says, you seemed to have had an idea of how the final image should appear. Can you say something about the importance of the mood you saw from start to end?
Yeah, I kind of pre-visualize these things out in the field. I think a lot of us do that, where you see a scene and it becomes more common the more well versed you get in post processing. But you stand in front of these scenes, and it starts giving you ideas of how you're going to make that final image look. So like I said before, we're standing out there, and even with 30-second exposures, this road was so long that I couldn't quite get a full car trail in there. So I'm thinking in my head when I'm taking it, okay, well, I'll do a lot of different versions of the car trails, so that when I get down back home where I can process this, I can stack them together. And I do that more often than not. I have an idea of how I'm going to make it look while I'm taking it. And a lot of that comes down to, when we shoot in RAW, we're not capturing a realistic version of the scene, because it's just the raw data from the camera. So it doesn't have any contrast or saturation or anything like that applied to it. So we kind of have to take this mental note of two things, both how it looked when we were there and how it made us feel. And then we kind of combine those to however we see fit in the final image. And then beyond that, one thing I was going to get to before was I don't do a whole lot of sky replacements, and everybody kind of lands on a different part of the spectrum there. So I've got friends like this guy CJ out in Hawaii. He doesn't do any exposure blending at all. Like, he sees that as going way too far with an image. Like, he'll only do single exposures. And if he does have to blend multiple ones, he goes out of his way to make a note of that when he shares it online. So for me personally, I don't think that's necessary. I don't mind blending exposures together from the same day, but then there's other people who are totally fine with taking a sky from Oregon, like a cool sunset they saw, and then combining it with a foreground that they took in Italy or something like that. And for me, I don't typically do that. I don't look down on anybody that does it, but the furthest I'll go is taking a nighttime shot of like the Milky Way, and then blending it with a foreground that I took that same evening at like blue hour, because sometimes the foreground is just too dark at night to bring in any detail to it. So I know that wasn't part of the question, but I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, that's great. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah. Are there any more questions, or should I hop into the next image?
I think you're okay to hop into the next image. There, a few customers were asking about the green fringing around the rocks, the chromatic aberrations there.
Yeah.
Maybe you could touch quickly just on how you would fix that. Don't spend too much time on it. I'd like you to jump to another image for us here, but there are a few questions about that.
Yeah, so the best way to address the fringing, and then that just goes back to how much time we're going to spend on the really minute details on a webinar. But the lens correction, I think it was on, but you can play with the sliders and make sure that you nip that in the bud before you get into adding effects. But if you still have some leftover, like we did in this image afterwards, one thing I like to do is I'll look at the color of the fringing, and I'll throw a color adjustment layer on top, and then I'll select that color like green or cyan or magenta, and I'll pull the saturation of that down, and then I'll just throw a mask over that adjustment layer and then paint through along that line, and that'll usually fix it. Does that make sense, Michael?
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's do another one. I thought this one would be fun, so we'll bring that up larger. We'll get rid of the film strip here. This was taken earlier this year in Kauai at a place called Ka Beach. It's on the very north side of the island. It's as far north as you can go on the road there. It dead ends at Ka Beach. And we were there in January, and winter is kind of the rough season in Kauai for the sea. It gets really angry. And it was exceptionally angry on this day. We were trying to capture these waves right about here. They come in, and there's some sort of underwater feature here that makes the wave just like explode up into the air and then fan out. And it's a really cool looking shot. But the sea was so crazy that day that it was just obliterating the waves before they could, fan out. It was just too crazy. And then, it was kind of hazy. We had this fog, which is volcanic fog from the Big Island, that had blown all the way over to Kauai. And so the whole island was kind of covered in this fog, and it was really hard to see. So it was some pretty tough conditions to shoot in. But a lot of the students that were on that trip with me were having a hard time with these photos because there was this fog, and the sun was kind of behind it, and it was just making this really tough scene where, this is the raw file, and it almost looks like a black and white because there's just not a whole lot of color to be pulled out. So we kind of worked through the image, and I wanted to show you guys what we did there. So if you have a scene like this where there's just not a whole lot of color, this might be an idea of what you can do with it. So we'll hop over into develop. Okay, the first thing we'll do just real quickly is pop these dust spots here, just the most obvious ones. We won't spend too much time on it. Looks like there might be one here. Okay, and then we'll do some basic adjustments here in tone and color. We'll give it some contrast. We'll pull the highlights back a little bit, not too far, just a little bit. We'll bring up the shadows to see if we can get some detail out of the rocks here and the water. And as we pull those up, you can see that there's a little bit of a hint of blue in the water here, but it's super faint. And maybe a little bit of hint of like a yellow warm tone in the sky here. So we've already got those complementary colors going of warm and cool. So we want to just kind of take that to the next level. So, we can play with the temperature slider, bring that up a little bit, saturate it a little bit more. But that's probably all we need to do with tone and color. So what we're going to do to kind of take this up a notch is go to the overall settings and show more. And we're going to do a split tone. Scroll down here. And by default, it's going to add pretty much what we're looking for. It's going to add a warm highlight and a cool shadow. So if you're not familiar with split toning, what it does is it adds a color cast or a hue to your highlights and your shadows, and you get to choose what that hue is. So the most common, the one that I use probably 99% of the time is adding a warm hue to the highlight and a cool hue to the shadows. And fortunately in this image, what we have a highlight applied to the sky and behind the water. And since the sun was like right up here, it's behind the water here. So the water is kind of captured in the shadows. So that works out well for this image, which makes it a good candidate for this split toning. So we'll go to our highlights here. We'll just click that little box and we can just drag this little thing around and get kind of like more of a yellow orange color cast here, like so. And then we can play with the slider here, make it brighter or warmer. But I want to make the effect pretty obvious here. So I'll bring it up somewhere around here. All right, and then with the shadows, we'll just do the same thing. Play with the lightness and darkness here. And I just want to make sure that I get an obvious blue tone in the water there. So if I go too far this way, it's going to start looking purple. If I go too far this way, it's going to start looking green. So you kind of just have to find a good middle ground there. Okay, maybe something like that. Then we can pull up the mount, and then we can use the hue slider here too if we think it might have gone too far in one direction. All right. And then we'll go back up to our saturation and pull this up, give it a little bit more contrast. Okay. All right. And there's our before and after. You can see the image kind of popping there, and that's just because our lens correction is turned on. So if we turn that off, it'll go back to that, and then we can do our before and after and nothing changes. So, one quick note about lens correction is it's not something I always use. I kind of like when it's off by default, and then I can come down and just click it on and see what it's doing and decide if I want to use it or not. It does a good job most of the time. What it will typically do is it'll correct a little bit of the distortion from the lens. This is a wide angle lens, or I'm sorry, it wasn't. It was a 70-200, but it'll correct a little bit of that distortion for you. And then if you look at the corners when you apply it, if you have any sort of natural vignetting caused by your lens, it will usually cut through that. So if you look at this corner right here, when I turn that on, you'll see that get a little bit brighter, just a hair. So, with an image like this, it's kind of a coin toss. I don't think it really makes a huge difference one way or the other. But yeah, there we go. Any other questions, Michael?
I don't see any that pertain specifically to this image. There is a question here from my buddy Gordon. Just if you were going to print this image, would you make any further adjustments? What would you add, like a screen sharpening? What would you do if you were going to print this image?
Sure. Yeah, I would definitely sharpen it a little bit. This isn't a 100% finished image, but yeah, sharpening. I would probably do a selective sharpening where I would take it into layers and just add some very selective sharpening to the water here and make sure that that's nice and sharp and has a good pop to it. I don't think we pushed this far enough to bring in any noise into the sky, but I checked that out for sure. But one other thing that I should point out, since we're on an ON1 webinar, is that I use ON1 for all of my prints. You know, whether I'm sending it to a client or creating a print for my home. I don't do my own printing at all. I never have. I've never cared about it. And again, just like the debate of what kind of skies you should drop on your frames, there's no right answer. I just I have a lot of things that I'm interested in, and printing on my own has just never really been one. So, but that said, I use ON1's resize to resize all my prints before sending them off to my print lab. And the print lab I use is Bay Photo out in California. So I would take this in, and if I was making a 40 by 60 print on metal, I would take this into resize and then upscale it to that size. Because even though this was taken with a Sony A7R II, which is a 42 megapixel image, it's still, you still need to upscale it to that exact size if you want it to look its absolute best. So that's what I have always done.
Awesome. So I have a little bit of a curveball here for you from John Blackwood. He's asking if you can go back into the develop module and if you can demonstrate the use of the eyedropper tool.
With that previous one, or this one?
You could probably, I don't know, the previous one, maybe you could do something with this one and, I don't know, change it to black and white. There's a few customers asking you if you could try changing this image to black and white from here.
Okay. Yeah, so we would go up to show more, and then I did that too quick. So show more and then click black and white, and that'll just convert it to a true black and white image. So from there, yeah, you can use the eyedropper, and you can kind of like click around. But I don't know. It's up to you how you want to use it. But I don't typically use the eyedropper, so I'm not super familiar with it, to be totally honest. I've always, whether it's Lightroom or ON1 or Photoshop, I typically just use the sliders, and the eyedropper would let you, focus in on certain colors and tones, but I pretty much have an idea of what colors are where before I do the conversion, and I would just use the sliders, to make the sky darker or brighter. And this one, I would make the sky brighter, and then I would come down to where those blues are, and those aquas, and make them, different levels and stuff like that.
Awesome. And then as far as the workflow, again, there's a few questions about when you save this image, when you're ready to be done and save it, how are you going to save this image and where is it going to go to? How are you going to decide where to send this image to print or to put on the web?
Yeah, so to save it out, you can go to File and then Export, and that's going to bring up your export dialog. I don't think I really need to, we can, but yeah, I could probably just talk through it.
Go through it. Actually, if you could pop open the export module right now, there was a few customers asking about how to add the watermark through the export module if you did have a watermark created. So if you could pop that open real fast from File Export, we can just show them how they can easily add that watermark there from the export module.
Yeah, so watermarking, I'm getting a weird feedback all of a sudden. Oh well. Watermarking isn't something that I've actually ever done. We're getting into another hot topic here. I'll try to be careful.
Yeah, just go to File Export, and we'll at least just show them real fast how you can add a watermark if you do want to add.
Yeah, are you seeing the export dialog on the right-hand side?
No, I'm actually not. I'm only seeing.
Oh, weird.
And I'm sure the customers probably are seeing the same thing. I'm not seeing the export dialog. I'm still seeing your overall settings. Perhaps it's how you're sharing the screen, maybe.
Yeah, I've got it on showing the ON1 window, and I, brought up the export dialog, so I'm seeing that on the right-hand side. So that's weird.
See if you can show your main screen. Does that allow you to?
Let's see. Screen. Did that change anything?
Yep, there we go. That shows it right there on the right side. Not sure why that happened. That's an interesting.
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah, so what I did was I just went to the plus sign here, and then you can add a watermark. So if you have like a PNG watermark, like your signature or something like that, you would just choose the file here. I don't have one because I never use them, but you would just change that, and then you could resize it here on the right-hand side, and choose what position you wanted it to be in.
And this is a great spot too. This would be, if you're doing any image resizing, exporting to the web, needing to change the long edge, just like you added that watermark there, you can also change the photo size.
Yeah.
Do that at the top right. So just another little tidbit about export.
Yeah. So my kind of approach to exporting is I typically, if I can, I like to process my initial image with as much information as possible. So what's great about layers is that it creates a PSD, and I save those PSDs forever, because 5 years down the road, I might want to come back and revisit an image, and having access to those original layers that I created and those masks and adjustments, it's really valuable. So it takes up a lot of space, but space is cheap these days, and it gets cheaper every day. So I don't really see a problem with it, but I have PSDs of virtually every photo I've ever processed. And I save those, as Pro Photo RGB. That's another thing that doesn't really matter. I mean, I save it that way because maybe one day we'll have access to viewing Pro Photo RGB in more places than just our computer. But before you send anything off to the web, you have to convert that to sRGB if you want it to look, somewhat accurate. And then you have to, if you're going to send it off to a printer, you have to double check with that printer first to make sure what color space they prefer. So Bay Photo, the one that I use, prefers sRGB, which is great. Some others are going to prefer CMYK, or they might even have their own custom profile that you have to use. But that's one reason I stick with Bay Photo, because they make it simple. There's not a whole lot of hoops to jump through. There's little things you have to know, like if you're going to export a photo to use on Facebook, most social media platforms like Facebook and Google Plus, even though most people don't use that anymore, they like their images to be a max of 2048 pixels wide. I don't know why that is. It's a random number, but 2048 pixels wide, sRGB, that's going to look the best. And you can choose all of that from this dialog box here. You can see that I already have it filled in because that's what I've done. And it saves that. So I've got the long edge resized to 2048 pixels with a resolution of 72. And that's just your standard web resolution. If you're saving it for print, they'll usually want like 300, which is what it starts out at. I'm trying to think of if there's anything else, but I hope that answered the question on how to export stuff.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of customers are very thankful about that. So good job on that.
Awesome.
So it looks like we have about 10 minutes left here in the webinar. It might be a great time for us, James, to announce your new photo kit that is launching today that some people might be getting emails about right now.
Yeah, I'm so pumped about this.
So yeah, we just launched a photo kit with James today. It's the ON1 Photo Kit Sunsets and Night Skies. It covers pretty much the ins and outs of ON1 Photo RAW, just like this webinar here, but a little more in-depth and specific for the sunsets and the night sky shots. James, if you want to jump in and just give them a little bit of info on that.
Absolutely. For those of you that know me, I've seen a lot of questions come in from people I know, like you, Doug. I don't know if Doug Blunt is still on there, but I see you, buddy. What's up? He was one of my students on a main workshop that I did, and I've done these post-processing courses in the past that they're available on my website, and I call them just a start to finish guide to processing landscapes. And I've done 2 of them, and they're just, I take them from, just like we did here, from beginning to end on how to process in different, software programs, Photoshop, Lightroom, ON1. But the one that I created for this photo kit is specifically for ON1. So I took 5 different images, and some of those are night sky images, like the Milky Way, or just taken under a starry night, as well as some sunsets and sunrises. And I just show what I do from start to finish. And it's, I think that's really valuable. It's something that I didn't have a lot of, or have access to a lot when I was starting out. There was a lot of post-processing learning materials out there that showed different aspects of how a program worked. But for me, the way that I learn, and I think a way that a lot of people learn, is it's really helpful to just see start to finish, what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So we included that, but that's kind of just what you're doing at home, or in your hotel room on a trip when you're processing photos. So I didn't want to stop there. So we threw in 2 of my ebooks. One of those is Tax Sharp, which was the first ebook I ever wrote. I think it's sold somewhere in excess of like 30,000 copies, because it's in its 4th edition now. And that's a field guide to using your camera to get sharper images, and all the crazy little settings and tips and tricks like back button focus, and there's all kinds of tips and tricks in there. So I've learned a lot over the years just from talking with other photographers and reading and trial and error. So that'll help you just cut down on your ratio of hits and misses when you're out in the field. And then I also threw in another ebook called Sunset and Beyond. And that's got all kinds of tips that I've learned over the years on planning your trip, more or less. So stuff that you do before you take the shot. So I've got some really advanced stuff in there, like using visible satellite imagery to follow weather patterns and predict when you're going to have good clouds for sunset. There was this one time I was doing a workshop in the Eastern Sierras, and we were going into Yosemite National Park to shoot sunset. And I pulled up the visible satellite imagery, and I saw that this high pressure system was moving into the area, and it was cutting off all the clouds. It was just killing all the moisture. So we turned around and bailed out of Yosemite and made it to Mono Lake before sunset. And we got an incredible sunset there with these amazing lenticular clouds over the lake. And just having access to that stuff and knowing how to read it is really valuable. And then I also go into stuff like planning a Milky Way shoot. There's apps that I use on my phone, like Star Walk, that can let you, before you even get there, know exactly where the Milky Way is going to be in the sky, what direction it's going to be facing, and you can get into Google Earth and plan out your landmarks and where you're going to be and stuff like that. So what this photo kit does is it helps you plan beforehand, and then it lets you learn tips and tricks to use on your camera, and then it teaches you how to process these photos from beginning to end once you get back home. So there's a lot going on here, and I didn't even get to the presets, but there's a lot of presets in there for ON1 as well.
Yep, so I did drop a link for everyone wondering in the chat window. There's a link right to the landing page for that photo kit. It is a limited time deal. It is available right now today. So feel free to go on over and check that out, see what James has to offer there. And I do have one more question for you before you sign off, and it is from your buddy Doug Blunt here. So I think he's throwing you a big curveball. So he says, it would be nice not to have umpteen different programs we felt compelled to use for achieving different types of things. I'm mainly curious to know if James is using Lightroom for storing his files, or is he still saving them to his hard drive? And I think I might know the answer to that, but I'll let you take that away there.
Yeah, so they're still on my hard drive, of course. I'm kind of in this weird place right now, Michael. ON1, you guys have done a fantastic job with it, and it keeps getting better with every update, more features added. So I'm kind of in this weird place where I'm still using all of them, and I'm using ON1 more and more and more. But but yeah, I think it's good to kind of, the good thing with ON1 is that it's gotten to a place now where you can just use ON1. And what I like about ON1, with the browse module specifically, is that it's just so fast. Like, we all know that the biggest hang up with Lightroom is the speed, and it bogs down and it gets really slow at times. And that's even with my computer, which is this, big old 5K iMac with a crazy processor and RAM and all that stuff, and it still bogs down. So ON1 has gotten ahead of the ball there, and really done some amazing things with speed and processing power. And you don't have to use Lightroom and Photoshop anymore. And it's really exciting to say that, because I think this competition is good for everybody. But there's still a few things like in Photoshop that keep me using it, like all the stuff you can do with luminosity masking and stuff. And I have no doubt that ON1 is gonna catch up with that in the near future. They've already got luminosity ability. It's just not quite as intricate, I guess. So
perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have about 2 minutes left, maybe 3 minutes here. So before we sign off, we've actually had about 20 customers in the last 5 minutes ask if you have any pictures of the eclipse that you could show us. I don't know if you
Nope.
do or not. This is just a random question that we've been asked by a ton of customers.
Yeah.
5 minutes.
No, I don't. I'm down here in Fort Worth, Texas, and I had open invitations from Brian Matias to drive up to Nebraska and shoot it with him, and I've got some friends out in the Smoky Mountain National Park area. Could have driven out there, but I had a lot of stuff going on here at home, deadlines to meet, things to get created, and I just, by the time Sunday rolled around when it was go time, I just I couldn't convince myself to make that drive out there. But that said, I will point you guys in the direction. My good friend Mike Mejuel, if you look him up, I think his Instagram is Mike Mez Photo. He got some really good shots of it out there in Oregon. And then Michael Shainbloom got a really cool one. I think it was in Oregon as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, Smith Rock.
Yeah.
Hiker. Yeah, that is an awesome shot.
Yeah.
And if anyone else is wondering, we are posting some on our Twitter page, just at ON1 Photo. We have a lot of customers submitting images in using the hashtag ON1Pics. So if anyone does have any cool eclipse shots they want to share, just any shots in general you want to share, feel free to use on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, hashtag ON1Pics. I know, James, you're doing an Instagram takeover for us right now on the ON1 Instagram. So if you guys liked this presentation from James, be sure to check out our Instagram throughout the week, and definitely check out his photo kit. And as I mentioned, I'll be putting this recorded webinar up on the blog this afternoon. So anyone looking for it, you can find it right at on1.com/blog.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, and that's pretty much all we have time for today. We got about 15 seconds left, so I'll make it real quick. Thank you, James, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.